the summary of the argument against the Pauline authorship of Hebrews is this: the letter just doesn't sound like him. So if you read Romans and Galatians and Ephesians, and you're steeped in the Pauline cadences, and then you come to Hebrews, it's not that there's any disagreement between Hebrews and what we see elsewhere in Paul, but there certainly is a stylistic difference. The Greek of the epistle to the Hebrews is eloquent, stylized Greek. Paul's letters are often written in the heat of the moment. Galatians comes to mind, and in Ephesians there's a sentence that Paul never gets around to completing. You don't have, it's not the polished, stylized Greek that you find in the book of Hebrews. So many people say, the Apostle Paul couldn't have written it. The style is completely different. That's basically the argument. Doesn't sound like him. The illustration I use is if you're familiar with the great Scottish Presbyterian writer, Samuel Rutherford. If you're familiar with him, you've probably read his letters. There's a Banner of Truth edition of that book out, and those letters are flowery and devotional, vivid, pastoral, and then the same Rutherford wrote Lex Rex, which is a political treatise, which is heavy, weighty, scholarly, turgid. And the stylistic difference between Rutherford's letters and Rutherford's work writing political theology is a dramatic one. Well, that's because Rutherford was a man of genius, and he could write in more than one style. He could write in more than one genre. So I don't see that there's any difference here with the Apostle Paul. Now, how do you account for the difference? There are three basic ways you could account for Hebrews being from Paul, and yet accept the fact that the style is remarkably higher. One is to say that the Apostle Paul wrote to the Hebrews in Hebrew, or in Aramaic, and which is a dialect of Hebrew. He wrote to them in that language, and what we have is a translation into Greek, and the stylistic polish is given to it by the translator. That's a possibility. Another possibility is, so the thought is Paul's, the structure of the argument is Paul's, but the style is the translator's. Another possibility is the lecture notes approach, where someone took notes listening to Paul preach this, or they took notes listening to Paul lecture on this. And so the structure of the argument is Pauline, the thought is Pauline, everything about it is Pauline, except for the style comes from the note taker who takes those notes and then smooths it out. Then the third option, and this is the one that I prefer, is that Paul was a man of genius and not a one-trick pony. That Paul, when called upon, when he had time to prepare, when he wasn't in the middle of a pastoral crisis, when he wasn't trying to manage a pastoral kitchen fire, he was able to sit down and write a learned and polished treatise, which is what the book of Hebrews is. So that said, that's giving an account of my answer to an objection. But what would be my positive argument for the Pauline authorship of Hebrews? The first is, I believe the Apostle Peter tells us that Paul wrote Hebrews. And here's how this goes. 2 Peter 3, 15 and 16, Peter refers to, Peter is writing to a particular group of people, and he tells these people that he uses the phrase, as Paul wrote to you. So he's, whatever the recipients of this letter from Peter, that group, that same group, got a letter from Paul. Well, what's that group? Well, you can see that 2 Peter is written to the same group that 1 Peter is written to, and in 1 Peter, it's written to the Jews it's written to Jews in the dispersion in all these named regions. It's written to a group of dispersed Jewish believers. And Peter says, in effect, to these people that he's writing to, it was the same way with our beloved brother Paul as he wrote to you. Well, when did Paul write to that group? When did Paul write to that group? I would suggest that the prime candidate for a letter of that nature to that group from the pen of Paul would be the book of Hebrews. Now, John Owen argues for the Pauline authorship of Hebrews at length, and what John Owen points out is this: if you say someone, Martin Luther suggested that maybe Apollos, for example, wrote it. We're told in Acts that he was an eloquent man and he was mighty in the scriptures, and the author of Hebrews was an eloquent man and was mighty in the scriptures. So it could have been Apollos and could have been Barnabas or someone like that. But as John Owen points out, what this means is that the church was in possession of a letter from the Apostle Paul that Peter referred to, and the church lost that letter from Paul and substituted another letter to the same group of people from another guy, and then didn't write down who that other guy was. So that's argument number one. Argument number two is that the book of Hebrews was admitted into the canon of Scripture on the strength of its Pauline authorship. The Western Church, there were doubts about the Pauline authorship of Hebrews in the West from the beginning at the time of its inclusion in the canon. But in the East, where they were closer to the action and they were closer to the language it was composed in and so forth, the eastern end of the church was absolutely convinced of the Pauline authorship of Hebrews, and their certitude convinced the Western church, and the entire church included it in the canon because it was from Paul. So I think that's another strong argument for the Pauline authorship of Hebrews.